What if a chance encounter on a lonely road could unravel a web of secrets buried for 15 years? When a 9-year-old girl with an extraordinary gift meets a man haunted by a forgotten promise, a single unassuming object becomes the key to unlocking a conspiracy that reaches the highest echelon of power. Prepare for a journey into a world of hidden truths, shocking betrayals, and the unbreakable courage of a child. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from as this gripping story begins. The late afternoon sun, a hazy orange orb, was already beginning its slow descent towards the vibrant tree line, casting long, dancing shadows across Old Miller's Road. 9-year-old Lily Carter, her worn sneakers kicking up little puffs of dust, trudged along the cracked asphalt, a small, determined figure against the vast expanse of rural New York State. Pigtails, the color of ripe corn, bounced against her shoulders with each step, and her bright, intelligent eyes scanned the familiar landscape. In one hand, she clutched the strap of her faded blue backpack, stuffed with school books and a half-eaten apple. In the other, she carried a small, surprisingly heavy metal toolbox, its surface scratched and dented from years of use. It was a legacy from her Uncle Gus, the man who had become her entire world since her adoptive mom, Sarah, had passed away 2 years prior. Gus Peterson, a mechanic with a heart as big as his calloused, grease-stained hands, had taught Lily more about engines and ingenuity than most grown men knew. He said she had a feel for it, a kind of magic in her small fingers. Lost in thought, humming a nameless tune, Lily rounded a familiar bend where the ancient oak tree stood like a silent sentinel. That's when she saw it, a sleek, black Mustang GT, looking as out of place on this quiet country road as a panther in a petting zoo. Its hood was up, a plume of steam still faintly visible against the cooling autumn air, and beside it stood a man. He was tall, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Uncle Gus earned in a month, and his posture radiated an impatient, almost palpable frustration. He kicked one of the Mustang's expensive tires with the toe of an equally expensive Italian leather shoe. This was Arthur Sterling, a name synonymous with Manhattan real estate. His days were usually spent in high-stakes negotiations, navigating the concrete canyons of the city, not stranded on some forgotten back road with a dead luxury car. His finely tailored suit felt constricting in the humid air, and the unfamiliar silence of the countryside, broken only by the chirping of crickets, grated on his nerves. He'd already yelled at his assistant over the phone, not that it had helped the abysmal cell service, and was contemplating the sheer indignity of his situation when he heard a small voice. "Got a problem, mister?" Arthur spun around, startled. He hadn't heard anyone approach. There stood Lily, tilting her head, her expression open and curious. The contrast between them was almost comical. The 9-year-old girl in her play-worn clothes, toolbox in hand, and the billionaire tycoon fuming beside his broken-down symbol of power and wealth. Arthur, not accustomed to being addressed so casually, especially by a child, managed a curt, "That's an understatement, kid. This blasted thing picked a fine time to die on me." His eyes, sharp and accustomed to assessing billion-dollar deals, swept over her, dismissing her as quickly as he would a speck of dust on his polished desk. What could a little girl possibly offer? Lily, however, wasn't easily intimidated. She'd grown up around engines that coughed, sputtered, and died. It was a language she understood. "Mind if I take a look?" she asked, already stepping closer, her gaze fixed on the Mustang's exposed engine with professional interest. "Sometimes it's just something simple." A flicker of amusement, quickly suppressed, crossed Arthur's face. "Look, I appreciate the offer," he said, a patronizing edge to his voice, "but this isn't exactly a bicycle. I need a proper mechanic, not—" He trailed off, not wanting to be overly rude to a child. But his skepticism was clear. Ignoring his dismissive tone, Lily set her toolbox down with a decisive click and peered into the engine bay. Her small nose wrinkled as she surveyed the complex machinery. "Uncle Gus says most fancy cars are just showing off. Underneath, they all need the same things: spark, fuel, and air." She pointed with a small, grease-smudged finger. "Your radiator hose looks like it's seen better days, mister, and that clamp's loose. Probably overheated and blew the hose when you pushed it." Arthur stared, momentarily stunned into silence. He knew next to nothing about cars, beyond turning the key and pressing the accelerator. But the girl's confidence was unnerving. He watched, a mixture of disbelief and a strange, reluctant curiosity, as she opened her toolbox. It was filled with an array of well-used, professional-grade tools, miniature versions of what he'd seen in high-end garages. She selected a screwdriver and a pair of pliers, her movements economical and precise. "Don't have a new hose," she announced, her voice slightly muffled as she leaned further under the hood. "But I might be able to patch this one enough to get you to Gus's garage. It's just up the road about 5 miles. He'll have what you need." She rummaged in her box again and pulled out a roll of heavy-duty duct tape and some wire. "The old reliable fix-it-all," she grinned, a flash of missing baby teeth making her look even younger. For the next 20 minutes, Arthur Sterling, a man who commanded boardrooms and reshaped skylines, stood by helplessly, watching a 9-year-old girl work on his prized Mustang. She tightened the clamp, expertly cleaned and dried the split hose, then meticulously wrapped it with layers of duct tape, securing it further with twists of wire. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her tongue poked out from the corner of her mouth, a miniature professional completely absorbed in her task. The frustration that had been simmering inside Arthur began to be replaced by a grudging admiration, and something else, a strange sort of discomfort. This tiny, self-assured human was a complete anomaly. "Okay," Lily finally said, wiping her hands on an old rag she produced from her pocket, leaving a new smudge on her cheek. "That should hold for a bit. Don't push it too hard, though, and keep an eye on the temperature gauge." She looked up at him, her bright eyes shining with a quiet pride. "That'll be, well, Uncle Gus usually charges 20 for a roadside, but since it's a temporary patch, let's say 10? Arthur almost laughed, the absurdity of the situation hitting him. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a $100 bill and handed it to her. "Keep the change, kid. You've earned it." Lily's eyes widened at the sight of the bill, but she hesitated. That's too much, mister." "Nonsense," Arthur said, a rare smile touching his lips. "Consider it a consultation fee. You clearly know more than my last mechanic." As Lily reluctantly took the money, folding it carefully and tucking it into her pocket, Arthur's gaze fell upon her left hand, specifically the small, delicate ring she wore on her pinky finger. It was a simple, slightly worn gold band, but the stone set within it, a deep, pigeon blood red, seemed to glow with an inner fire even in the fading light. It was a ruby, and a remarkably fine one at that, far too valuable, he thought, for a child living in these rural circumstances. But it wasn't just the value that caught his attention. The ring itself, the specific hue of the ruby, the way it was set, pricked at something deep within his memory, a fleeting image, an echo of a feeling he couldn't quite grasp. It was like a word on the tip of his tongue, a forgotten dream that left a lingering, unsettling sensation. He frowned, trying to pinpoint the source of this sudden, inexplicable disquiet. An orphanage, a child's tear-streaked face, a promise whispered. The fragments were hazy, disjointed, but the ruby ring was the anchor. "That's a very unusual ring for a little girl," he found himself saying, his voice softer than before, an uncharacteristic curiosity lacing his tone. Lily glanced down at her hand, her fingers instinctively closing around the ring. "It was my mom's," she said, her voice losing some of its earlier brightness. "My mom's Sarah. She said it was special, a lucky charm to keep me safe." Sarah. The name meant nothing to him, yet the ring, it pulsed in his vision, a tiny red ember burning away the layers of years, threatening to ignite a memory he wasn't sure he wanted to recall. The unease intensified, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He needed to get back to the city, back to his ordered life, away from this dusty road and this strangely perceptive child with her mother's ring. He cleared his throat. "Well, thank you, Lily. You're quite the lifesaver." He got into the Mustang. The engine, to his astonishment, turned over on the first try, settling into a slightly rough but steady idle. Lily beamed. "Just take it easy. Gus's garage, big blue sign, you can't miss it." As Arthur Sterling drove slowly away, the image of the small girl, waving from the side of the road, her pigtails dancing, was strangely persistent, but it was the glint of the ruby ring and the unsettling tremor it had sent through his carefully constructed world that occupied his thoughts all the way back to Manhattan. A forgotten promise, a buried past. Something had just been disturbed, and he had a sinking feeling that the ripples would spread further than he could possibly imagine. The indignation of a long-forgotten injustice, though he couldn't yet name it, began to stir within him. The relentless, orchestrated chaos of Manhattan usually had a way of sandblasting away any lingering impressions from the outside world. Arthur Sterling's penthouse, a glass-walled eyrie perched high above Central Park, was his fortress of solitude, a place where the city's roar was reduced to a distant hum, and where his thoughts, typically laser-focused on acquisitions, mergers, and the ever-shifting tides of the real estate market, were his own. Yet, in the days following his misadventure on Old Miller's Road, the city's formidable distractions proved ineffective. The image of the 9-year-old girl, Lily Carter, with her grease-smudged cheek and startling competence, kept replaying in his mind. More persistently, it was the glint of the ruby on her small hand, a deep, knowing red that seemed to throb with a life of its own. He found himself staring out at the panoramic cityscape, a glass of expensive scotch untouched beside him, the ruby's image superimposed over the glittering lights. It wasn't just a ring, it was a key, unlocking a dusty, cobweb-strewn room in the archives of his memory. The promise. He'd been a teenager then, barely 15, dragged along by his well-meaning mother on one of her charitable visits to a place called St. Genesius Orphanage. He remembered the echoing hallways, the smell of disinfectant and old linoleum, the rows of identical iron-framed beds, and he remembered a girl, a tiny thing with enormous, haunted eyes, clutching a tattered doll. He hadn't caught her name, or if he had, it was lost to time. But he'd felt an uncharacteristic surge of protectiveness, a desire to shield her from the palpable sadness that clung to the very walls of the institution. He'd impulsively slipped off a small, inexpensive ring his grandmother had given him, a band with a tiny red stone, a cheap imitation of a ruby, and pressed it into her hand. "This will keep you safe," he'd whispered, a foolish, boyish gesture. "I promise one day things will be better." Could it be the same ring? Logic dictated it was impossible. That was a trinket. This was clearly a genuine, valuable ruby. And yet the emotional echo was undeniable. The unsettling feeling the ring on Lily's finger had evoked was tied to that long-ago moment, to that forgotten promise. It was an itch he couldn't scratch, a discordant note in the symphony of his well-ordered life. Sleep offered little respite. His dreams were filled with shadowy figures, the glint of red, and a child's pleading eyes. Driven by a compulsion he didn't fully understand, a force that seemed to emanate from that disquieting memory, Arthur did what he always did when faced with an unknown. He initiated an acquisition of information. He dialed his head of security, a former NYPD detective named Frank Rourke, a man whose discretion and tenacity were legendary. "Frank," Arthur said, his voice crisp and businesslike, "I have a delicate matter. I need you to find out everything you can about a 9-year-old girl named Lily Carter, residing with her uncle, Gus Peterson, a mechanic somewhere near Miller's Road, upstate. And specifically, I want to know about a ruby ring she wears." He omitted the part about the Mustang. It felt too personal, too odd. Frank, accustomed to his employer's sometimes eccentric but always purposeful requests, simply said, "Consider it done, Mr. Sterling." While Frank's investigation quietly commenced, Arthur found himself making an uncharacteristic trip back upstate a few days later, under the guise of having Gus Peterson give his Mustang a proper once-over and to personally thank the mechanic for his niece's assistance. His true motive, however, was to see the girl, to see the ring again, to try and reconcile the image in his mind with the reality. Gus Peterson's garage was exactly as Lily had described. A large, slightly ramshackle blue building set back from the road, surrounded by an assortment of vehicles in various states of repair. Gus himself was a man whose physical appearance mirrored his establishment, solid, dependable, a little rough around the edges, but clearly built to last. His handshake was firm, his gaze direct and appraising, as Arthur explained his presence. Lily was there, helping clean spark plugs, her pigtails smudged with grease. She greeted Arthur with a shy but genuine smile, the $100 bill incident apparently forgiven, if not forgotten. Arthur engaged Gus in conversation about the Mustang, asking questions about its maintenance, all the while subtly observing Lily. The ruby ring was still there, a small speck of brilliant red on her busy hand. Seeing it again in the harsh fluorescent light of the garage only intensified Arthur's unease. He felt like a man on the edge of a precipice, a vast, dark chasm of the unknown yawning before him. Gus, though polite, was clearly wary. He answered Arthur's questions about the car with professional courtesy. But his eyes kept straying to Lily, a silent protective shield. He was a simple man in many ways, but he possessed a keen intuition, honed by years of dealing with all sorts of characters. He'd seen the way the rich man's gaze lingered on Lily, on the ring. It wasn't lecherous, not in the way that would have had Gus reaching for a tire iron, but it was intense, an unwelcome interest. He'd heard stories about wealthy city folk with strange hobbies, collectors of oddities. Lily and that ring her mother had cherished were not for collecting. "She's a good kid," Gus said, his voice casual but with an underlying firmness as he wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze meeting Arthur's directly. "Her mom, Sarah, did a fine job with her before. Well, before. Lily's all I've got left of my sister in a way. I look out for her." The message was unspoken but clear. Stay away if your intentions aren't pure. Arthur, recognizing the protective wall Gus was erecting, nodded. "She's remarkable. A credit to you both." He paid Gus for his time, a generous amount that Gus accepted with a curt nod, his suspicion not visibly lessened. Back in Manhattan a few days later, Frank Rourke delivered his preliminary report. The findings were concise, delivered in Frank's typically dry tone, but each detail tightened the knot of apprehension in Arthur's chest. Lily Carter, 9 years old, adopted at approximately 6 months by Sarah Miller, now deceased. Cause of Sarah Miller's death 2 years ago. Complications from pneumonia. Lily has been in the sole custody of her maternal uncle. Gustav Peterson since. Standard stuff mostly. Frank paused, then added, "Here's where it gets interesting. Sarah Miller, before she moved upstate and kept a low profile, was a registered nurse. Her last known place of employment in New York City, St. Genesius Orphanage." Arthur felt a jolt, a cold shock that ran down his spine. "St. Genesius," Frank continued. "The orphanage was shut down rather suddenly about 15 years back. Records are a mess, a lot of them lost in a supposed basement flood around the time of closure. But I dug up a former staff manifest. Sarah Miller was definitely on it. And according to a flagged note in an old social services file I managed to access through a contact, Miller went off the grid right around the time St. Genesius was closing its doors. The note implies she may have left with a child under her care, unofficially. The child was never formally reported missing by the orphanage, which is odd in itself. The timeline suggests that child was Lily. The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. Sarah Miller, a nurse at St. Genesius, fleeing with a baby. Lily, around the time the orphanage, the same one from his hazy teenage memory, was mysteriously shut down. And Lily now possessed a ruby ring her mother had told her was a lucky charm to keep me safe. Safe from what? Or whom? The vague unease Arthur had felt on that country road solidified into a chilling premonition. This was no coincidence. The ring, the orphanage, the girl, they were all connected in a way that spoke of secrets and desperation. The initial indignation he'd felt, that abstract sense of a long-forgotten injustice, now began to take on a more defined shape. Something was profoundly wrong with this picture. Something dark had transpired at St. Genesius, and Sarah Miller had run from it, protecting the child who now wore that ruby ring. Arthur Sterling, a man who prided himself on control and foresight, felt a rare tremor of fear, not for himself, but for the innocent girl whose life was unknowingly entangled in a past that was rapidly and dangerously coming to light. The promise he'd made as a boy to a nameless, faceless child in a sad, echoing hall suddenly felt very real and very urgent. He had a feeling his investigation had only just scratched the surface of something far more sinister. The name St. Genesius Orphanage, once a hazy recollection from Arthur Sterling's adolescence, now echoed in his mind with an insistent, ominous resonance. Frank Rourke's initial report had cracked open a door to a past that felt both distant and disturbingly immediate. Sarah Miller, a nurse, a sudden flight with a child, an institution shuttered under a veil of mystery. And at the center of it, Lily, a 9-year-old girl with an extraordinary aptitude for mechanics and a ruby ring that felt like a burning coal in Arthur's memory. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that he couldn't let this go. The boyish promise he'd made years ago to a nameless child had somehow, inexplicably, found its way back to him, wrapped in the enigma of Lily Carter. Frank Rourke, methodical and thorough, continued his work, but Arthur felt a pressing need for a more human connection to Sarah Miller's past. He needed to understand the fear that had compelled a nurse to snatch a child and vanish. Among the sparse details Frank had managed to unearth about St. Genesius's former staff was a list of names, many of whom had scattered to the winds after its closure. One name, however, had a recent address attached: Martha Periwinkle, listed as a senior care assistant during Sarah Miller's tenure, now a resident at the Silver Lining Senior Care Facility in a quiet suburb of Queens. Arthur, eschewing his usual chauffeur and opting for a less conspicuous sedan, drove to Silver Linings himself. The facility was clean, a little too quiet, with the faint, ubiquitous scent of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables. He found Martha Periwinkle in a sun-dappled common room, a tiny, bird-like woman with wispy white hair and eyes that, despite her age and frailty, held a spark of keen awareness. She was initially guarded, her responses to his polite inquiries about St. Genesius clipped and evasive. The past, it seemed, was a place she preferred not to revisit. Arthur, however, could be remarkably persuasive when he chose. He spoke gently, not as a billionaire tycoon, but as a man seeking to understand, to perhaps right an old wrong. He explained, carefully omitting any direct mention of Lily or the ring for now, that he had a personal historical interest in St. Genesius and the welfare of the children who had passed through its doors. He spoke of his own family's past charitable involvement, a carefully constructed half-truth designed to build rapport. He assured her his motives were entirely benevolent. Slowly, painstakingly, Martha began to open up. The loneliness of her current existence, perhaps, or something in Arthur's earnest demeanor, chipped away at her reserve. Her memories of St. Genesius were tinged with a lingering sadness and a distinct undercurrent of fear. It wasn't always a bad place, she said, her voice thin and reedy, her gaze distant. In the beginning, we truly tried to care for those children. So many of them lost little souls. When Arthur carefully steered the conversation towards Sarah Miller, Martha's eyes misted over. Sarah, oh dear Sarah, such a good heart, that one. Too good for a place like St. Genesius, especially near the end. She described Sarah as a dedicated nurse, fiercely protective of the children, especially the smallest, most vulnerable ones. There was one little mite, Martha recalled, her fingers twisting in her lap. A baby girl. Sarah was utterly devoted to her, used to sing to her, hold her for hours when she was off duty, said the babe had the oldest eyes she'd ever seen. Arthur felt his breath catch. Do you remember this child's name? Martha shook her head. Names. So many names. They blur. But I remember Sarah being worried, terribly worried, about the adoptions. Here, Martha's voice dropped, her eyes darting around the common room as if expecting to be overheard, even after all these years. Things changed when Mr. Finch took a more active interest. Alistair Finch. The name, when Martha uttered it, was laced with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He was our benefactor. You see, a pillar of the community, charming as a movie star and twice as convincing. He'd sweep in with his donations, his smiles, his promises of a brighter future for our children. But beneath the philanthropic veneer, Martha explained, there was something unsettling. The adoptions became peculiar. Certain children, often the brightest, the prettiest, would be fast-tracked. Families, always wealthy, always well-connected to Mr. Finch, would appear out of nowhere. The paperwork, usually a mountain of it, would just sail through. Sarah, she noticed things. She had a knack for it. She said Mr. Finch seemed to be curating the children, like he was picking out prize blooms for a special garden. The analogy sent a shiver down Arthur's spine. Sarah believed Mr. Finch was involved in something deeply unethical, Martha whispered, leaning closer. She suspected he was selecting children for these powerful families for reasons that went beyond just giving them a home. She thought it had something to do with, I don't know, their backgrounds, their potential, as he used to call it. She tried to raise concerns quietly with the administrators, but she was shut down, told she was imagining things, that she should be grateful for Mr. Finch's generosity. Martha sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. She grew terrified, especially for that one little girl she was so fond of. Shortly before the place closed down, Sarah vanished, took the child with her, I always believed. It was a brave thing to do, a dangerous thing. Arthur left Silver Linings with a profound sense of disquiet. Martha's words had painted a chilling portrait of Alistair Finch and the atmosphere of fear and secrecy that had pervaded St. Genesius. The idea of curated children and potential was deeply disturbing. His next step was to approach Lily and Gus again, this time with a more defined, albeit still carefully veiled, purpose. He arranged another visit to Gus's garage, ostensibly to discuss a classic car restoration project he was considering, a plausible excuse for a man of his means. He brought a generous gift basket from a high-end Manhattan delicatessen, a gesture of goodwill, while Gus meticulously inspected the schematics Arthur had brought for the fictitious restoration. Arthur found a moment to speak with Lily, who was, as usual, tinkering with some discarded engine part. He knelt to her level, his voice gentle. "Lily," he began, "that day on the road, you mentioned your mom, Sarah, and the beautiful ring you wear." Lily's face softened at the mention of her mother. "Yes, sir. She said it was very old and very important." "Did she ever tell you anything else about it?" Arthur asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "Where it came from, perhaps?" Lily frowned in concentration, tapping a small wrench against her chin. "She said it was a promise of safety. And she told me it came from a good person a long, long time ago, someone who wanted to protect her and then wanted to protect me." Her innocent eyes, full of unwavering belief in her mother's words, met his. "She called it my guardian angel ring, a promise of safety. A good person." Arthur felt a pang. A complex mix of guilt for his youthful naivety and a burgeoning sense of responsibility. The ring he had given that child in the orphanage had been a trinket, but this was a substantial ruby. Had Sarah somehow acquired it, or replaced his original, to give the promise more weight, more substance in her desperate flight? Or was there another layer to this mystery he hadn't even begun to comprehend? "Your mum sounds like she was a very special woman, Lily," Arthur said, his voice a little hoarse. "She loved you very much to want to keep you so safe." "She was the best," Lily agreed, a wistful look in her eyes. "I miss her." Gus, overhearing the tail end of the conversation, approached, his expression still tinged with a protective caution, though Arthur's consistent, respectful demeanor was slowly eroding his initial distrust. "Sarah was one of a kind," Gus affirmed, ruffling Lily's hair. "Fierce as a mother bear when it came to this one." As Arthur prepared to leave, the image of Alistair Finch, charismatic benefactor, alleged manipulator of young lives, loomed large in his mind. Martha Periwinkle's fear, Sarah Miller's desperate flight, Lily's innocent faith in a guardian angel ring, it all pointed towards a man who operated in the shadows, exploiting the vulnerable for purposes Arthur could only begin to guess at. The casual cruelty of it, the calculated selection of children as if they were commodities, sparked a cold rage within him. The indignation was no longer a faint whisper, it was a growing roar, demanding that the truth, however ugly, be dragged into the light. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that Alistair Finch was not a man who would appreciate anyone digging into his past, and the path ahead was likely fraught with peril. The information gleaned from Martha Periwinkle, coupled with Lily's innocent yet profound statement about her mother's ring being a guardian angel ring from a good person, solidified Arthur Sterling's resolve. This was no longer a vague curiosity sparked by a roadside encounter. It was rapidly becoming a deeply personal crusade. The spectre of Alistair Finch, the philanthropic puppet master allegedly curating children for unknown, nefarious purposes, cast a long, cold shadow. Arthur knew he was treading on dangerous ground. But the thought of Lily, a child whose life had been so profoundly, and perhaps secretly, shaped by this man, fueled his determination. His immediate challenge was Gus Peterson. The mechanic, fiercely protective of Lily, remained a formidable gatekeeper. Arthur understood that any further progress, especially if it involved delving into Sarah Miller's life more intimately, required Gus's trust, if not his outright cooperation. He decided on a direct approach, laying out what he had learned, the closure of St. Genesius, Sarah's connection to it, Martha Periwinkle's unsettling recollections about Finch's special adoptions, and his own deep, inexplicable connection to a promise made at that very orphanage. He omitted, for now, the full extent of his wealth and resources, framing his investigation as a personal quest for understanding tied to a youthful pledge. He met Gus at the garage after hours, the scent of oil and old metal thick in the air, lending a gritty reality to their clandestine conversation. Gus listened, his weathered face unreadable, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He was a man of few words, his trust earned through actions, not pronouncements. He'd spent his life fixing things that were broken, understanding the mechanics of cause and effect. What Arthur was describing was a broken system, a perversion of care, and it resonated with the quiet, unspoken grief he still carried for his sister, Sarah. He remembered her anxiety in the years before she'd finally settled upstate with Lily, her guardedness, her fierce, almost desperate love for the child. Sarah was running from something, all right, Gus finally said, his voice a low rumble. Never said what, not in so many words, just that Lily needed to be kept safe, away from people who didn't have her best interests at heart. He looked at Arthur, his gaze sharp. This Finch fella, if he's what you think he is, then Sarah did right by Lily, but digging this up, it could be like poking a hornet's nest. I know, Arthur acknowledged, but if Lily's past involves a man like Finch, she might never truly be safe unless the truth is brought to light. He needs to be exposed, Gus, for Lily and for any other children whose lives he might have manipulated. It was the mention of Lily's continued safety and the raw sincerity in Arthur's voice that finally swayed Gus. He thought of Sarah's last years, the constant looking over her shoulder, the almost frantic way she'd protected Lily. If Arthur was right, then that fear hadn't died with Sarah. It was a dormant threat, and Lily was still at its center. All right, Sterling, Gus conceded, a reluctant respect dawning in his eyes. Sarah, she kept things, old things from her life before Lily, and things from when Lily was a baby. After she passed, I packed most of it up. There's a trunk in the attic of her old place, the little cottage she rented before she moved in with me when she got too sick. Never had the heart to go through it proper. The next day, a crisp Saturday morning, found Arthur and Gus in the dusty, cobweb-laden attic of the small clapboard cottage where Sarah Miller had spent her final years with Lily. Sunlight streamed in through a single grimy window, illuminating dancing dust motes. The air was heavy, with the scent of old wood, dried herbs, and forgotten memories. In a far corner, beneath a faded floral sheet, was an old steamer trunk. With a shared sense of trepidation and anticipation, they opened it. Inside, nestled amongst neatly folded baby clothes, worn photo albums, and bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, was a small, unassuming wooden box with a simple latch. It didn't look like much, but both men felt a prickle of intuition. This was it. Inside the box, they found what Sarah had so carefully hidden: several slim, leather-bound diaries, their pages filled with her neat, precise handwriting. Some entries in a curious shorthand, almost a code. There were also a few faded black-and-white photographs of nurses and children at St. Genesius, their smiles frozen in time, belying the unease that Sarah's later diary entries would reveal. And finally, a collection of yellowed newspaper clippings, all featuring Alistair Finch. Finch at charity galas, Finch donating generously to civic causes, Finch lauded as a paragon of philanthropy. The public image versus the private fear. The diaries were the key. Arthur and Gus spent hours poring over them, the coded sections proving frustratingly difficult. That evening, back at Gus's house, Lily, observing their furrowed brows and the mysterious books spread across the kitchen table, wandered over. "What's that, Uncle Gus?" she asked, pointing to a recurring symbol Sarah had used in the coded passages, a stylized bird with a broken wing. Gus was about to gently shoo her away when Arthur had an idea. "Lily, honey," he said softly, "do you remember your mom ever drawing pictures like this? Or maybe a toy you had?" Lily tilted her head, her brow crinkled in thought. She traced the symbol with her small finger. It looks a little like the bird on the music box Mama Sarah kept on her dresser. The one that played a sleepy song." She hummed a few bars of a sweet, simple lullaby. "She said it was from a place where she worked with lots of babies before I was born. She said the bird was sad because it couldn't fly free." The innocent observation was a breakthrough. The sad bird became their Rosetta Stone. The lullaby, they later discovered, was a mnemonic device Sarah had created, each note corresponding to a letter substitution. The coded entries, once deciphered, painted a horrifying picture. Sarah Miller's neat script chronicled her dawning awareness of the true nature of St. Genesius. It wasn't just an orphanage, it was, as she came to suspect, a sophisticated supply chain for Alistair Finch. He wasn't just facilitating adoptions, he was engineering them. Children with specific desirable traits, intelligence, artistic talent, even certain physical characteristics that aligned with the legacies of prominent families in Finch's network, were identified early, their records subtly altered, their progress meticulously, almost clinically, monitored. Sarah wrote of Finch's chilling obsession with genetic potential and optimal developmental environments. She described secret wings of the orphanage, where certain children received specialized enrichment, which she feared was a euphemism for intense observation and psychological conditioning. Her entries detailed her growing terror, her sense of isolation, as her quiet attempts to voice concern were dismissed or subtly threatened by Finch's loyal administrators. The decision to flee with Lily, who was one of the children receiving this special attention, was an act of desperate maternal courage. She believed Lily was in imminent danger of being placed in a situation that would strip her of her identity and future. The weight of these revelations was immense. Gus sat in stunned silence, his face pale, the realization of what his sister had battled and what Lily had escaped, hitting him with full force. Arthur felt a cold fury build within him, a deep, visceral outrage at Finch's monstrous manipulation. The danger Sarah had fled was not confined to the past. 2 nights later, Arthur returned to his Manhattan penthouse to find his state-of-the-art security system disabled, his study ransacked. It was clearly a professional job, disguised to look like a high-end burglary, but nothing of significant monetary value was taken. What was disturbed, however, were his files, his computer. They hadn't found the translated copies of Sarah's diaries. Arthur, paranoid after reading them, had stored them in a secure off-site vault, but the message was clear. Finch, or his operatives, knew someone was digging. The following day, Gus called Arthur, his voice tight with anxiety. A nondescript dark sedan had been parked down the street from his garage for most of the morning, its occupants making no secret of their surveillance. When Gus had walked towards it, it had slowly driven away, only to reappear an hour later. They were being watched. The game had changed. Alistair Finch was no longer a shadowy figure from the past. He was a present and active threat. His resources were vast, his reach extensive, and his ruthlessness, as evidenced by Sarah's diaries and the recent intimidation tactics, knew no bounds. The indignation Arthur and Gus felt was now tinged with a very real fear, not just for themselves, but for Lily, the innocent child who stood at the center of this dangerous, unfolding conspiracy, a symbol of everything Finch had sought to control and everything Sarah had fought to protect. The thinly veiled threat of the ransacked penthouse and the unnerving surveillance outside Gus's garage served as a stark accelerant to Arthur Sterling's investigation. Alistair Finch was clearly aware that his meticulously constructed facade was being chipped away, and he was reacting with the silent, predatory aggression of a cornered animal. The coded diaries of Sarah Miller had provided a terrifying glimpse into Finch's twisted ideology and the operations at St. Genesius. But Arthur knew they needed more than a deceased nurse's suspicions to confront a man of Finch's power and influence. They needed irrefutable proof, something that would not only expose his past action, but also demonstrate a pattern of manipulation that continued to the present day. The recurring theme in Sarah's diaries about Finch's obsession with genetic potential, lineage, and his almost clinical monitoring of certain children, particularly Lily, gnawed at Arthur. It felt incomplete, as if Sarah herself had only grasped part of a larger, more insidious design. He watches her like she's an experiment, one particularly chilling entry read. He compares her progress to something, another chart, another child. I can't be sure, but there's a coldness in his interest, a detachment that frightens me more than any open cruelty. This specific phrase, compares her progress, stuck with Arthur. He recalled Frank Rourke's earlier comment about the St. Genesius records being a mess, many lost in a supposed flood. What if some records weren't lost, but carefully expunged or duplicated for a different purpose? He tasked Frank with a near-impossible feat, to try and reconstruct any birth records or intake forms from around the time Lily would have entered St. Genesius, looking for anomalies, for anything that might hint at another child with a similar profile or entry date. It was a long shot, relying on fragmented archives, unofficial channels, and the hope that not every trace of Finch's machinations had been perfectly erased. Simultaneously, Arthur reached out to an old acquaintance from his university days, a man named Julian Vance, who now held a senior, albeit somewhat obscure, position within the New York State Department of Health, specifically in the division overseeing vital records. Their relationship was one of cautious mutual respect, built on a shared history that predated Arthur's immense wealth. Arthur knew Julian was a man of integrity, but also one who understood the delicate dance of information access. He flew Julian to New York for a private dinner, laying out a carefully edited version of his concerns, a potential case of child endangerment stemming from irregularities at a defunct orphanage, possibly involving falsified adoption records. He emphasized his desire to protect a child, appealing to Julian's sense of duty. Julian, after a long contemplative silence, agreed to look into it, swayed by Arthur's genuine concern and the gravity of the implications. "No promises, Arthur," he'd said. "The system is designed to protect privacy, even when it sometimes shields wrongdoing. But if there's something overtly irregular concerning a minor from St. Genesius around that period, I might be able to identify a flag, a discrepancy." Weeks passed, filled with gnawing tension. Arthur and Gus took pains to vary their routines, to ensure Lily was never left alone, acutely aware of Finch's unseen eyes. The dark sedan was no longer a constant presence, but the feeling of being watched lingered, a corrosive unease. During this time, Lily, blissfully unaware of the true nature of the storm gathering around her, continued to be a source of unexpected light. Her straightforwardness, her uncanny ability to fix almost anything mechanical Gus threw her way, her unwavering belief in the good of people, it was a stark contrast to the darkness they were uncovering. She'd sometimes ask about Arthur's secret project and why he and Uncle Gus looked so serious all the time, but she accepted their vague answers with a child's easy trust. Then the breakthrough came. From two directions almost simultaneously. Frank Rourke, through a painstaking cross-referencing of partial hospital birth logs from the area around St. Genesius and fragmented intake notations he'd managed to unofficially acquire, found an anomaly. Two female infants, born on the same day, at the same struggling inner-city clinic that often transferred undocumented or at-risk newborns to St. Genesius. Both entries were vague, almost deliberately obscured, but the listed birth weight and preliminary health indicators were virtually identical. One was simply listed as baby girl doe A, the other baby girl doe B. One of these, he surmised, was Lily. The confirmation, however, came from Julian Vance. He called Arthur late one night, his voice low and troubled. "Arthur," he said, "I found something more than just an irregularity. I found a mirror, a ghost in the machine." He explained that around the time of St. Genesius's closure, an adoption was finalized for a female infant whose birth circumstances and initial intake markers were an exact match to what little fragmented information existed for Lily Carter prior to her informal adoption by Sarah Miller. This other child's adoption, however, was handled with extraordinary speed and funneled through a private agency known to have close ties to Alistair Finch. The adoptive parents were a wealthy, childless couple, Harrison and Eleanor Ainsworth Sr., known associates and beneficiaries of Finch's financial empire. The child's adopted name, Eleanor Ainsworth. "Arthur," Julian continued, his voice heavy, "the birth records from that clinic for that specific day were tampered with, heavily. It looks like an attempt to create two distinct, untraceable origins from a single event, or rather, a paired event. Identical birth stats, down to the ounce, born minutes apart. It's not definitive proof from my end without a court order to unseal further records, but the implication is, well, you understand genetics, Arthur. The probability of two unrelated infants matching so precisely is infinitesimal. Identical. The word hung in the air. Arthur felt a wave of nausea. Twins. Lily had an identical twin sister. The full monstrous scope of Alistair Finch's scheme slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just about curating children or ensuring a supply of desirable adoptees for his cronies. This was something far more twisted, more diabolical. He had separated infant twins, two halves of a whole, at birth. One, Eleanor Ainsworth, was delivered into a life of privilege, wealth, and undoubtedly into Finch's carefully controlled sphere of influence, groomed, no doubt, for some specific role in his grand designs. The other, Lily, initially also under his observation at St. Genesius, was the contingency, perhaps, or the control group in some perverse, long-term behavioral or developmental study. Finch, with his God complex and obsession with genetic potential, was likely comparing their progress, their talents, their very beings, shaped by vastly different environments, nature versus nurture, played out with living, breathing human children as his unknowing subjects. Sarah Miller's diaries took on an even more terrifying clarity. Her fears about Finch, comparing Lily's progress, her feeling that Lily was an experiment. Sarah hadn't known the full truth, but her maternal intuition had sensed the horrifying core of it. She had known Lily was uniquely vulnerable, uniquely targeted, Her flight with Lily wasn't just to save her from an undesirable adoption, it was to rescue her from being a lifelong pawn in Finch's cruel, narcissistic game. Arthur immediately shared the news with Gus, whose face, already etched with worry, crumpled in anguish and fury. "Twins?" he choked out, his voice hoarse. "He took 2 babies. My sister. She never knew for sure, did she? But she must have suspected something was terribly wrong with how much attention Finch paid Lily. The thought of another little girl, Lily's exact image, living a gilded life while Lily grew up with so little, yet possessed so much heart and resilience, was almost too much to bear. The injustice was a raw, gaping wound. The cruelty was breathtaking. Alistair Finch hadn't just manipulated adoptions, he had played God, sundering a natural bond for his own perverse satisfaction and strategic gain. He had treated human lives, the sacred connection of twin sisters, as mere variables in his depraved equation of power and control. And Lily. Lily, with her bright spirit, her innate goodness, her incredible ability to mend what was broken, from engines to, perhaps even fractured souls. She was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. A vibrant flower blooming in the most unpromising of soils, completely unaware that she was one half of a divided whole, her existence a defiant refutation of Finch's attempts to reduce her to a mere data point. Her light, Arthur realized, didn't just shine despite the darkness of her origins. It shone because of the strength and love instilled by Sarah and nurtured by Gus, a love that Finch, in all his power and wealth, could never comprehend, nor ever truly extinguish. The fight to expose him, to bring down his empire of lies, was no longer just about justice. It was about reclaiming the stolen sisterhood of 2 innocent girls. The revelation that Lily Carter had an identical twin sister, Eleanor Ainsworth, cruelly separated at birth and unknowingly raised as part of Alistair Finch's grand, manipulative design, transformed the nature of Arthur Sterling's quest. It was no longer just about uncovering past misdeeds or fulfilling a boyish promise. It was about rectifying a profound, ongoing injustice, about reuniting, if possible, 2 sundered lives, and about dismantling an empire built on the exploitation of innocence. The confirmation from Julian Vance, coupled with Frank Rourke's meticulous groundwork, painted a picture so monstrous it left both Arthur and Gus Peterson reeling, yet steeling their resolve. Their alliance, forged in the dusty attic of Sarah Miller's old cottage and tempered by shared discoveries and mutual respect, solidified. Arthur, the Manhattan magnate with his vast resources and strategic mind. Gus, the salt-of-the-earth mechanic with his unwavering loyalty and protective instincts. And Lily, the unsuspecting 9-year-old, whose very existence was a testament to resilience, became an unlikely trio bound by a common purpose. Lily, of course, was not privy to the darkest details of Finch's machinations or the existence of a twin sister. The burden of such knowledge was too great for her young shoulders. To her, Arthur was a kind man, helping to understand her late mother's important past, and Uncle Gus was, as always, her steadfast protector. Her presence, however, her bright spirit and unquestioning trust, served as a constant, poignant reminder to both men of exactly what was at stake. She was the living embodiment of the hope they were fighting for. Arthur, leveraging his network, quietly began to corroborate Eleanor Ainsworth's existence and her connection to Alistair Finch. He discovered that the Ainsworths were indeed very close to Finch. Their considerable fortune largely derived from early, lucrative investments in Finch's myriad enterprises. Eleanor, now also 9, was a public figure in her own small way, occasionally photographed at exclusive charity events with her parents, often alongside Finch himself, portrayed as a charming protégé, the bright future of a philanthropic dynasty. The images Arthur found of Eleanor were like looking at Lily through a distorted, diamond-encrusted lens, the same wide eyes, the same set of the chin, but adorned in designer clothes, her hair perfectly coiffed, her smile a little too polished, a little too practiced for a child her age. The contrast with Lily, with her smudged overalls and artless grin, was heartbreaking. As Arthur dug deeper into Finch's current activities, a prime opportunity for a public reckoning began to emerge. Alistair Finch was just weeks away from hosting his signature annual event, the Angels of Charity Gala. It was the glittering jewel in his philanthropic crown, a meticulously orchestrated affair held at one of Manhattan's most iconic ballrooms, attended by the city's wealthiest and most influential figures, politicians, business titans, celebrities, all eager to bask in Finch's carefully cultivated aura of benevolence. For Finch, it was a night to solidify his power, to launder his reputation, and to solicit astronomical donations for his various charitable foundations. For Arthur, it presented a stage of unparalleled visibility, a chance to shatter Finch's pristine image before the very audience he sought to impress. The decision to target the gala was fraught with risk. Finch was not a man to be underestimated. As Arthur's inquiries grew more pointed, as whispers of his interest in St. Genesius and old adoption records began to circulate through the city's more discreet channels, Finch's retaliation escalated from subtle intimidation to overt aggression. Arthur's publicly traded company faced a sudden, coordinated short-selling attack, clearly designed to destabilize its stock value. Vicious, anonymous rumors about his business ethics and personal life began to appear on obscure financial blogs, only to be mysteriously amplified by more mainstream, though less reputable, media outlets. He received a discreet visit from a former colleague in the real estate world, a man known to have Finch's ear, who delivered a veiled but unmistakable warning. "Some sleeping dogs, Arthur, are best left to lie, especially the ones with very sharp teeth." Gus, too, felt the pressure. Anonymous complaints about his garage's safety standards were lodged with local authorities, resulting in surprise inspections designed to harass and disrupt his livelihood. The dark sedan made more frequent, menacing appearances on his street. Lily's safety became their paramount concern. Gus, with Arthur's discreet financial backing, installed a state-of-the-art security system at his home and garage, and Lily's school was quietly alerted to a potential, though unspecified, custodial concern, ensuring she was never left unsupervised. Gus, a man who had never backed down from a physical challenge, now found himself battling an enemy who fought with whispers, lawyers, and the crushing weight of influence. His protective instincts, always strong, sharpened into a fierce, almost primal vigilance. The tension was a constant thrumming presence, making sleep a luxury and every ringing phone a potential threat. It was during this period of escalating hostility that a new, unexpected ally emerged. Clara Holloway was an investigative journalist, sharp, tenacious, and possessing an almost encyclopedic knowledge of New York's corporate underbelly. For years, she had been chipping away at the edges of Alistair Finch's empire, suspecting that his philanthropic activities masked something far less palatable, but she had always lacked the concrete proof, the inside source, to land a decisive blow. An old contact of hers, aware of Arthur's increasingly public, albeit still unofficial, inquiries into Finch, discreetly put them in touch. Their first meeting took place in a nondescript coffee shop in a quiet corner of the city, far from their respective worlds of penthouses and newsrooms. Arthur was initially wary, accustomed to journalists seeking sensationalism. Clara was equally cautious, aware of Arthur's reputation as a ruthless businessman. But as they spoke, as Arthur carefully laid out the non-sensitive aspects of his investigation, Finch's control over St. Genesius, the suspicious adoptions, the fear he instilled, a mutual respect began to form. Clara listened intently, her questions sharp and insightful. She, in turn, shared her own extensive research into Finch's complex web of shell corporations, his political connections, his uncanny ability to make scandals disappear. "Finch is more than just a corrupt businessman, Mr. Sterling," Clara stated, her gaze unwavering. "He's a master manipulator, a puppeteer who pulls strings at the highest levels, To take him down, you need more than just a historical grievance. You need to sever those strings, publicly and unequivocally. Clara possessed the journalistic expertise, the sources within city bureaucracy, and the understanding of how to frame a narrative for maximum public impact that Arthur lacked. Arthur, in turn, had the personal stake, the financial resources, and, crucially, Sarah Miller's diaries and the emerging story of the twins. The human element that could transform a financial scandal into a story of profound moral outrage. Their alliance was born of necessity, but it quickly deepened into a partnership built on shared purpose and a growing admiration. Arthur was impressed by Clara's courage and her unyielding commitment to truth. Clara found herself respecting Arthur's unexpected depth of feeling and his willingness to risk his own considerable standing to pursue justice for a little girl. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a subtle current of connection that went beyond their immediate goal, hinting at a future where their combined strengths might build something more lasting than just a news story. With Clara on board, the plan to expose Finch at the Angels of Charity Gala began to take concrete shape. It would be a high-wire act, requiring meticulous timing, irrefutable evidence, and nerves of steel. They worked in secret, acutely aware that Finch's surveillance was likely sophisticated and far-reaching. Frank Rourke handled sensitive document verification and security. Gus provided a grounded perspective and unwavering support, while Arthur and Clara strategized the narrative, the delivery, the legal shield they would need. As the date of the gala approached, the air grew thick with anticipation and a palpable sense of dread. Finch, sensing a confrontation was imminent, became even more unpredictable. One of Gus's prize-restored classic cars in his garage was vandalized, a clear message of intimidation. An anonymous source leaked a fabricated story to a tabloid suggesting Arthur Sterling was on the verge of a mental breakdown, his obsession with a long-dead nurse a sign of his instability. Each move Finch made, each attempt to silence them, only fueled their determination. The reader, witnessing these escalating injustices, would feel their own anger and impatience for Finch's comeuppance grow. The looming gala was no longer just a party, it was a battlefield, and the future of many lives, especially Lily's and her unknown sisters, hung precariously in the balance. The quiet heroism of Gus, the unexpected integrity of Arthur, and the brave tenacity of Clara stood as a fragile bulwark against the encroaching darkness of Finch's empire. The grand ballroom of the Astoria, one of Manhattan's most storied and opulent venues, was a sea of glittering diamonds, rustling silk, and the low hum of powerful conversations. Alistair Finch's annual Angels of Charity Gala was in full swing, a meticulously crafted illusion of benevolence and high society. Waiters glided silently with trays of champagne, a string orchestra played softly in the background, and Finch himself, charismatic and impeccably attired, moved through the throngs of New York's elite like a benevolent monarch, accepting accolades and substantial donations for his web of foundations. He was the picture of magnanimity, his smile unwavering, his eyes, however, holding a glint of something cold and watchful. Particularly when they scanned the room for any sign of Arthur Sterling. Arthur arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, almost understated presence, flanked by Clara Holloway, whose professional demeanor masked a steely resolve, and Gus Peterson, looking uncharacteristically formal in a rented tuxedo, his discomfort offset by a fierce determination in his eyes. Frank Rourke and a discreet security team Arthur had privately hired were already in place, blending into the background, ensuring their carefully laid plans could unfold. They had one shot at this, one opportunity to detonate the truth in the very heart of Finch's self-constructed temple of lies. The initial part of the evening proceeded as Finch had orchestrated, fawning speeches from beneficiaries of his generosity, a slickly produced video highlighting his global philanthropic endeavors, and the ceremonial presentation of oversized checks. Arthur, Clara, and Gus watched, a knot of tension tightening in their stomachs, waiting for the precise moment Clara had identified. A brief interlude scheduled just before Finch's keynote address, when the media presence would be at its peak and the room's attention most focused. As a minor city official finished his sycophantic introduction of Finch, Clara gave Arthur a subtle nod. This was it. Before Finch could take the stage, Arthur Sterling, a name that commanded respect and attention in its own right, moved purposefully towards a secondary microphone that Clara's press credentials had allowed her to request for a brief acknowledgement from a fellow philanthropist. The organizers, caught off guard but unwilling to publicly snub a man of Arthur's stature, hesitated just long enough for him to reach it. A hush fell over the ballroom as Arthur began to speak, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight of authority that cut through the ambient chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces, "we are here tonight to celebrate charity, to acknowledge generosity, but I stand before you to speak of a different kind of legacy, one hidden behind a carefully crafted facade, a legacy of manipulation, exploitation, and stolen lives." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Alistair Finch, who had been halfway to the main podium, froze, his urbane smile faltering, a flicker of something akin to panic darting across his eyes before being quickly suppressed. His security detail began to move, but Frank Rourke's men subtly and with professional efficiency blocked their path. Arthur didn't raise his voice, but every word resonated with cold, hard truth. He spoke of St. Genesius Orphanage, not as a haven for the lost, but as Alistair Finch's personal hunting ground. He recounted Sarah Miller's courage, referencing her meticulously kept diaries, copies of which Clara had already ensured were at that very moment being delivered to the city's major news outlets and the district attorney's office. He detailed the arranged adoptions, the obsession with genetic potential, the chilling practice of monitoring children as if they were mere subjects in a perverse experiment. Financial records, painstakingly unearthed by Clara and verified by forensic accountants Arthur had hired, flashed onto the large screens flanking the stage, screens that were supposed to be displaying Finch's charitable triumphs, now hijacked by Clara's tech-savvy assistant. The money trail was undeniable, linking Finch's foundations to questionable private adoption agencies and offshore accounts. "For 15 years, Arthur declared, his voice ringing with controlled fury, "Alistair Finch has built an empire not just on shrewd investments, but on the shattered lives of innocent children, treated as commodities, their futures bartered for power and influence." Finch, his face now a mask of rage, tried to signal for the microphone to be cut, but it was too late. The narrative was too compelling, the evidence too damning. The elite crowd, moments before sycophantic, was now a gallery of shocked, horrified faces. Then came the moment Arthur had both dreaded and prayed for. "One of these children," he announced, his voice softening slightly as he turned towards the side of the stage, "escaped his control, thanks to the bravery of a woman named Sarah Miller. This child is a testament to resilience, to the enduring power of love over manipulation." He paused, and then, into the stunned silence, Lily Carter, holding Gus's hand, walked onto the stage. She was small, dressed in a simple new dress Arthur had bought her, her pigtails neat, her eyes wide as she took in the sea of faces, but her chin was held high. She clutched the small, worn toolbox in her other hand, a symbol of her unassuming strength. The sight of this innocent 9-year-old girl, the living proof of Finch's long-buried secrets, sent a fresh wave of shock through the ballroom. But Arthur wasn't finished. Mr. Finch's cruelty, however, did not end with one child. His grand experiment required a control, a comparison. He looked directly at Alistair Finch, whose face was now ashen. "Ladies and gentlemen, Alistair Finch did not just manipulate the life of one child from St. Genesius. He orchestrated the separation of identical twin sisters at birth." As if on cue, from the opposite side of the stage, a young girl, the mirror image of Lily, the same wide eyes, the same delicate features, but dressed in an expensive party dress, her expression bewildered and scared, was gently guided forward by a woman Arthur recognized as one of Finch's executive assistants. This assistant, it turned out, was the anonymous ally Clara had cultivated, a woman whose conscience had finally outweighed her loyalty to Finch. This was Eleanor Ainsworth. The visual impact was devastating. The two little girls, Lily and Eleanor, standing mere feet apart, yet separated by a lifetime of secrets and manipulation, were the irrefutable, heart-wrenching evidence of Finch's depravity. Gasps and cries of disbelief echoed through the ballroom. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than any applause Finch had ever received. Lily looked at Eleanor, her brow furrowed in innocent confusion, then a dawning childlike recognition of seeing her own face on another. Eleanor simply stared, her carefully constructed world visibly shattering around her. Alistair Finch stood exposed, his carefully crafted persona demolished in a matter of minutes. The gala, intended as his night of triumph, had become his public execution. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The press, armed with Clara's meticulously prepared information packets, unleashed a firestorm. Federal and state authorities, spurred by the irrefutable evidence and public outrage, launched immediate investigations. Finch's empire, built on a foundation of lies, began to crumble. His allies deserted him, his businesses faced boycotts, and his carefully constructed charitable facade was exposed as a hollow sham. Within weeks, Alistair Finch was arrested, his fall from grace as spectacular as his ascent had been calculated. The months that followed were a period of adjustment and healing. Alistair Finch's trial was a media sensation, laying bare the full extent of his crimes. He was found guilty on multiple counts, his sentence ensuring he would never again harm another child. For Lily, the revelations were overwhelming, but with the unwavering support of Arthur and Gus, she began to process the truth of her origins. Arthur, true to his reawakened promise, formally became Lily's legal guardian, providing her with the stability and security she had always deserved. Clara Holloway, whose journalistic integrity had been instrumental in Finch's downfall, found her professional partnership with Arthur evolving into a deep, abiding love. Together with Gus always an integral part, they began to forge a new kind of family, one built not on bloodlines or societal expectations, but on shared experience, mutual respect, and unconditional love. Eleanor Ainsworth's journey was more complicated. Freed from the gilded cage of Finch's influence, and with her adoptive parents facing their own legal and social repercussions for their complicity, she was placed in a supportive therapeutic environment. The meetings with Lily were initially hesitant, filled with the awkwardness of strangers who shared a face but not a history. Yet, slowly, tentatively, a bond began to form, a fragile shoot of sisterhood emerging from the scorched earth of their past. In a final act of symbolic cleansing and profound hope, Arthur, using a significant portion of his own fortune alongside assets seized from Finch's corrupt foundations, purchased the dilapidated site of the former St. Genesius orphanage. The dark, oppressive buildings were demolished. In their place, a bright, modern and welcoming structure began to rise, the Sarah Miller Legacy Center, a community hub dedicated to providing resources, education and loving care for vulnerable children and families. It was a place designed to nurture potential, not exploit it, to offer sanctuary, not secrecy. The opening day of the center was bright and filled with sunshine. Lily, now 10, stood between Arthur and Clara, her hand also holding Gus's. She looked at the new building, her ruby ring, Sarah's promise, now also a symbol of her own journey, glinting on her finger. She saw Eleanor standing a little shyly with her compassionate new foster carers, offering a small, hesitant wave, a genuine smile, full of hope and a wisdom beyond her years, lit up Lily's face. The shadows of the past had been faced, the darkness confronted, and before her stretched a future where she was seen, she was safe, she was loved, and she was finally truly free to be herself. The legacy of St. Genesius would no longer be one of pain, but one of healing, all thanks to a chance encounter on a dusty road and the courage to pursue the truth.